Well, one thing with my husband and I, when we started funding our accounts when the kids were newborns, but my husband was kind of like, why would we do this? They're newborns, like college is so far away. And then I showed him a compounding chart of like, wait, but we can put this amount of money in now and then stop funding, or that money will grow. Whereas if we wait 10 years, it'll be X amount more money that we'll have to save. And for him and his brain, that worked.
Welcome to Finance for Physicians, the show where we help physicians like you use money as a tool to live a great life. I'm your host, Daniel Wrenne, and I've spent the last decade advising physicians on their personal finances, with the mission to help them understand that taking control of their finances now means creating a future where they can practice medicine where, when, and how long they want to. Theresa, welcome to the podcast.
Hello.
You're usually behind the scenes, but today you are in the front and center.
Yes.
We're talking about a fun topic, at least for us, personal finance geeks, but I think it should be a topic everybody's thinking about, especially if you have kids. And so we're going to be covering the 529 plan and talk in particular about some of the misunderstandings or misconceptions about how it works. Those kinds of things can have major costs to those of you guys listening. I've personally encountered a lot of those misconceptions and misunderstandings in our work one-on-one with families. So we're going to talk through a little bit about how they work, why they're beneficial, why they might be problematic, and then also intertwine some of these misunderstandings. So yeah, we'll be covering that. So Theresa, maybe we should get into a little bit. We're not going to get into the weeds too much, but just high level, like let's talk about like what is a 529, like what makes it so unique?
Yeah. So a 529, I kind of like to think of it as a Roth account for college savings. So this idea that you're putting after tax dollars into an account where you're ideally investing in it in an appropriate way from the perspective of when your kid's going to go to college. So often these accounts will have, similar to what you see in a retirement account, a target date fund, or the ability to kind of make your own investment portfolio. And ultimately, that money grows tax-free. And as long as you use the distributions to pay for an approved educational expense, then there are no taxes paid on that money when they come out. So it's a really powerful vehicle, especially if you start early, for saving for college. So some unique things that you'll see in a 529 that you won't see in a Roth account is that these particular funds are run by the state. So you don't necessarily have to use the 529 that is provided by your state, but you will have an option in your state. And really what you want to look for is kind of the tax advantages of using your state 529 versus a different state. So some states, like I'm in Massachusetts, I don't have a really great state tax write-off, but I do get a $2,000 deduction for my state taxes when I make a contribution. So everyone on the federal on the distributions get the same treatment depending on what state you're in and the state tax rules in your state. You may also get a deduction or a credit on the front end as well.
So taking a little bit of step back. So Roth, just as a reminder, like that goes in after you've paid tax on the money, and then it's tax-free for as long as it's there.
Yeah.
And then when you would take it out. So that's Theresa said Roth for education. So it's same tax-wise, kind of. I mean, for the most part, it's same tax-wise in that goes in after tax, tax-free, as long as it's there. And then when you take it out, if it's used for qualified expenses, that's the part that it's a little different than a Roth.
Sure.
Qualified expenses, it's got to be used for certain qualified expenses. And if you use it for those, it's tax free. The other difference between the Roth is that it can sometimes be tax beneficial on the front end. And that's, Theresa was also mentioning, that depends on states. Every state's different. but there is potential, depending on your state, to get some tax advantage on the front end as well, which makes it, potentially slightly better. But the big thing I always emphasize with the 529 is it's when you get something that's like all the tax benefits are on the back end. Same with Roth. Like you don't like day one, you don't get much or any tax benefit. There's no tax benefit day one because it's like your money's already been taxed and it just goes in there.
Mhm.
But like the benefit comes when it starts to grow. And if you know about compound interest, it's all about time. And the longer the time that goes by, the bigger the compounding and it gets exponential. And so when you have exponential or compounding growth for really long periods of time, the tax benefit becomes massive because all of that growth is what's the part that's tax free.
Mhm.
And so just like the Roth, the 529 plan, it's really especially beneficial if you can get started earlier. The earlier, the better, and because you can really save a lot on the growth, the tax free part of it.
Mhm.
And so the unique parts about it, that's really where it shines in terms of the tax benefits. But it gets a little confusing. Like it's not a little, it's super confusing actually. It's like you talking like every state has one, and then each state has different tax treatment of it. Like that's extremely confusing. Um, but let's try to like boil it down a little bit. Like what's the
Yeah, and I think if people are getting overwhelmed with this idea of there's too many options, take a look at your state plan. There, in the show notes, we'll provide a couple resources too to help look at the different state plans. But at the end of the day, they're all pretty much structured similarly in that what you're looking for, just like you would look for in your retirement accounts or low cost funds. They have that again that target date fund is I think the majority of our clients are in a target date fund when it comes to college savings. So I think that's, you can get overwhelmed by the options, but start with your own state and make sure, as long as it's a, kind of a gold kind of, I think Morningstar rates them. And if they're gold or higher, I think you'll probably be in really good shape from an account perspective.
yeah, and there's a pretty big range in the states. There's some really bad 529s. I know Kentucky, I live in Kentucky, and there's no tax benefits associated with living in Kentucky and funding a 529. So you don't, it doesn't matter if you fund a 529 or not. It doesn't affect your taxes in the front end.
Right.
And then also Kentucky has its own 529 plan that a lot of people think they need to use because they live in Kentucky, but they definitely don't have to, and it definitely doesn't affect your taxes living in Kentucky because there's no tax benefit on the front end. But
Hmm.
also, the Kentucky 529 happens to be not a great one. So, like, I would never typically suggest like starting with a Kentucky 529, just as an example. And each state's a
Yeah.
little different, but there's some bad ones. And then there's also the advisor thing. Like a lot of 529s have embedded commissions on the funds to pay advisors. So this might be the case if you've had, I don't know, if you worked with an advisor like out of in residency or something like that, and they were like an insurance advisor, or like at a brokerage firm, or they didn't charge you a fee to work with them. That's a classic scenario. And so a lot of times they sell 529 plans and they almost always have commissions on the funds. And so that's important because you might not realize that you're in one of those plans and you're paying pretty hefty commissions, even if you're not really working with the advisor anymore.
Hmm.
So that's something to look out for as well. You want to watch for the expenses. So,
And I will tell you, Morningstar will tell Utah 529 is the one that keeps coming up as kind of always on the top of the list. So if your state doesn't have a great plan, take a look at Utah's 529. I think Nevada too tends to have a pretty high rating as well. So there, again, we'll share some resources on where to look at kind of the top plans. So if you take a look at yours, it's not a good fit. It has some of the issues that Daniel is talking through. There are resources to figure out what might be a better fit.
yeah. And then tax benefits we started to hit on. That there's tax deductions and tax credits. Most 529s, well, you can get a list, you can Google a list of all of the states, and essentially you'd ask like, does my state offer a tax deduction on 529 contributions? And you should be able to get a pretty straightforward answer. There's, I don't know, probably half or maybe three-quarters of states offer some form of tax deduction. And then
Hmm.
I know for sure there's at least one that has a tax credit. Indiana has a really good tax credit for funding a 529. The difference is a credit is like you get straight dollars for funding it. It's like if you put $100 in, you get $5 back on your taxes. I'm just throwing out an example of what a credit is. And whereas a deduction is just it reduces your taxable income. So it's a percentage savings per dollar. And so typically when you do the math on it, tax credits are much better. Um, but you want to understand. So like Teresa, what's Massachusetts deduction?
Yeah, it's a $2,000 married couple deduction.
So that's like effectively that's like if you made 100,000, well, Massachusetts, and you put 2,000 in a 529, Massachusetts is like, well, we'll count it as 98 because you did
Right.
that. And so that's like 2,000 less of income and multiplied by whatever the state tax rate is. So, it's not typically going to be a substantial savings. So you can kind of weigh that into the situation. Like I've seen people that have states that have very low deductions, very low tax benefits, and also they require you to use their state 529 to get the deduction.
Hmm.
And their state's 529 also happens to be, super crappy. So it's like the net of all that, it's like, we're going to use a different state and just, forfeit the deduction. That's possible in certain instances. And then the other thing I was going to throw out, just because it's like this is such clear stuff, is let's make it more complicated. Is the tax parity thing we were talking about earlier, Teresa.
Yeah.
Like there's a handful of states that I think it's 9 states, but I'll list them. It's Arizona. As of this recording, it's Arizona, Arkansas, Kansas, Maine, Minnesota, Missouri, Montana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania. If you're in one of those states, they'll give you the tax deduction whether you fund the 529 in their state or any other state. So that's kind of nice because it allows you to basically look at all the different states
Hmm.
529s and pick the more competitive one, and you don't have to necessarily use that state 529.
Yeah.
That
Great.
all makes sense?
Makes sense. Makes sense to me.
Yeah. Let us know if it doesn't make
Yeah.
sense.
So
Yeah.
I think, one thing we also hear from folks, and, I think we just wanted to talk about briefly is this idea about, flexibility with these accounts. So
Mm,
like, like a retirement account, you're locking up this money for a particular purpose, and it's to fund education. But, sometimes when we talk this idea of starting early, there's a lot of unknowns in 18 years and 15 years and 10 years. So kind of there's I think a hesitancy or some concerns about whether or not these accounts make sense, knowing that you think your kid's going to go to college, but maybe they don't, or what if they get a giant scholarship, or those types of things. So I think we just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of what how these accounts work, and what
mm.
are some potential ways to use those funds if they don't go the
Yep.
traditional route.
I think the way I like to look at it is um it'd be great if we could predict the future. That would be helpful for this because it's all about like how much are you going to spend in the future on education? So
Hmm.
that's the big, huge question mark. And when I say future, I mean the rest of your life. So, and potentially even beyond that. We'll talk a
Hmm.
little bit about that. But the question is, how much are you going to spend in the future in your lifetime and potentially beyond that on these qualified expenses, which are education and related expenses? So just like I'll throw out an example. It's like let's say you have 7 kids. That's nobody's probably gonna have that. That's on the high end, but let's say 7 kids, and they're all of them are in private K through 12, you expect to pay for all their private school tuition. I don't know how you could afford that, but it's just hypothetical. And then your goal is to also pay for all of their undergrad 4 years tuition room and board at Ivy League schools. And then also your goal is to fund, they're all going to go to medical school, and you're going to fund all that for them as well, like all seven of them. Like I'm kind of giving you the extreme example to paint the picture. It's like that sort of extreme situation. If that's the goal, it's like we're super confident you're going to have future spending on education. So like it's more a matter of how much can you put in as opposed to whether or not you should fund a 529. That's like a home run sort of 529 use case. It still becomes a question as to how much you can put in, but that's a scenario where it's very obvious that it would make sense to fund. Most people are not quite in that extreme scenario. So say you got like, couple kids and they're not going to go to private K through 12, but you do know you want to fund their undergrad tuition room and board, both children's tuition room and board, 4 years. And let's just say it's average in-state public university costs, but you don't want to fund anything beyond that. Like that's probably a more common, low cost common, I guess, scenario. So in that scenario, you could, say, well, let's look at funding, say, 50% of their future expected costs for tuition room and board, at least to start, because you never know whether they're going to get scholarships or whatnot. And this could be something you start when they're a newborn.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other thing about that is you can look at it every single year. I mean, and the goals change as well. Let's take a quick break to talk about our firm, Wrenne Financial Planning. The goal of our podcast is to empower you to make better financial decisions. But sometimes the best financial decision you can make is to work with someone who understands your financial goals and has the expertise to keep you on track to reach them. That's where Wrenne Financial Planning comes in. We are a full-service financial planning firm that works with over 400 physicians and their families across the country. We charge a transparent monthly flat fee for our services and offer virtual meetings you can take from anywhere. Best of all, you'll get to work with a team that specializes in working with physician families. So whether you're starting out and wondering how you'll balance your student loan payments and saving for a home, or you are an established physician trying to figure out how to pay for your kids' college and how much you need to save to reach financial freedom, we can help. I'll put a link in the show notes to schedule a no obligation meeting with one of our certified financial planners. Wrenne Financial Planning, LLC is a registered investment advisor. For more information about our firm, please visit wrennefinancial.com. That's WRENNE financial.com. And I'm hitting on the education use case. Like the nice thing about it, maybe you could go into that, Theresa. There's a fair amount of backup options.
Yeah, and I think what Daniel's talking about, the K through 12, that's something that is relatively new from something you can use these accounts for. So as of, I think, summer 2025, they actually bumped up. Initially, it was $10,000 you could use per year. Now it's $20,000 per year worth of educational expenses for K through 12 at private school.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something outside of the traditional undergrad that you can use it for. They've also expanded it as of summer of 2025 to include testing and SAT related costs. So that's kind of more things kind of on the front end before you get to college, at least. And then I think many may have heard there was this now you actually can use funds funds to fund a Roth account, a true Roth account. There are a lot of stipulations with that, and it's a lifetime $35,000 that you can do. So that's an additional thing that you can use these funds for. Trade schools as well are you can use the funds to do that. And then also too, there are things that may come up over the years that you can use it for. These accounts are flexible from the perspective of your family unit. So for example, my husband last year decided he wanted to take some continuing ed courses And I was able to take funds from one of my kids' 529 plans and transfer that over within minutes to pay for him to take those classes. And that is totally allowable with the
Mm.
IRS. And so you can use it for yourself as well. So I could have transferred that money over to me and created an account and done it that way. Extended family as well. And then also, I think Daniel kind of alluded to this, there's a legacy component to this as well. So the account is your account and you have your beneficiaries. You, as the owner of that account, can change those beneficiaries. So your kids
Mm.
may not go to college, or they go to college, you have leftover funds, then you can actually use those funds to pay for your grandchildren as well. So there's a lot of options on how to use these funds.
Right. Yeah. And I was talking with somebody the other day and they started to get the whole like flexibility part and they're like, okay, well, how do we like make sure and fund the grandkids' education now? And I'm like,
Yeah,
well, that's the kind of the right mindset. Now they still have young kids, so it's a little hard to not a little hard,
sure.
it's almost impossible to pinpoint that cost. But um the way I look at it is that's just one additional reason to maybe think about getting more aggressive with it now
Hmm.
because it's just added flexibility. Whereas if they were like, you can only use it, it used to be you could, well, it, 10 years ago, well, I guess 5 years ago, it was a lot more limited in what you could use the 529 for. And since then, they've opened it up, like, for example, the K through 12, and now it's 20,000. Like, that's added potential things you can use it for, and then the Roth IRA that it's going to make
Hmm.
it more appealing to get a little more aggressive in how much you're funding it. At the end of the day, you're still going to want to like look at what is the goal and how much do you need to fund to reach the goal. Last thing I'll throw out on the funding part is a lot of people are like, well, should I fund it for tuition next year? My kid's in private school, okay, say they're in high school or something, and should I use it to start funding their tuition for next year because I pay it annually. And so, I mean, and that's a good question, but the problem with that approach, well, it's not a problem. It's just you don't get a lot of the going back to what we were saying at the beginning. The biggest tax benefit is all about the compound growth and
Yeah.
tax-free interests, and it's not on the front end of your contribution most of the time. Now, there's you got to look at your state to understand that fully, but on the average, it's mostly about the compound growth for long periods of time. So there is a little bit of tax benefit in putting the money in and then using it 6 months or a year from now because you'll save some interest on it, and it's better to have it be tax free. But it's not near as good as if you were to use it for, say, education costs 10 or 15 years from now.
Mhm.
So kind of the way I look at that is I say, let's try to backfill it. Like, let's backfill the furthest out years that you can confidently plan for. And then, as it gets more full, like let's say the future longer term goals are already 100% funded, then you might be thinking about like using it to fund next year's tuition just because you've kind of already covered the furthest out years that get the most bang for your buck.
Yeah. So Daniel, when we're working with clients and they're trying to get a sense of like how much money to put into the 529, like from like what the end point is, like what things,
Mhm.
how do we kind of talk to clients about how much they should put in that, in an ideal case, like how much money they should be investing in a 529?
Yeah, it kind of goes back to the scenarios I was throwing out. Like we want to understand, you know, how important it is to them, what their goals are for funding education. But um, like I'll use the example of the two children and they want to fund 4 years of undergrad only, and that's the goal. Um, it might we're going to try to explain the pros and cons and like look at the numbers, but it might be that we settle on like let's go ahead and start saving monthly. Let's just say it's like $300 a month or something per child. Let's go ahead and start saving monthly. The equivalent of what we've calculated needs to be set aside so that you get to 50% funded in the time when they're going to be in undergrad. Or another way of looking at it would be like you're going to be able to fund 2 of the 4 years, and that the reason you would potentially say 50% funding is because that like gives you lots of wiggle room if you're a little concerned about the downsides of the 529 and it being limited to being used for education, to where you can, use other things, or maybe you're like, my kids are going to get full scholarships because we're amazing athletes or whatever,
Yeah.
it just builds in the flexibility. So that's usually like, I mean, that's just an example, hypothetical. Sometimes we have the conversation, people are like, well, let's go ahead and get to 100% funding and we can always pare down. It's like if you're funding the thing monthly, you can change it a ton of different. I mean, you can
Yeah.
change it each year and adjust.
And one thing I think I forget sometimes too is that, depending on your career and where you are, there may be a good chance you're working during this time and can cash flow some of this as well. So,
Yeah.
especially if you're in a high cost of living state, like I put two kids in daycare, and I look back now and they were both in daycare. I was paying a private school college
Yeah.
tuition for a year
Super
and was
expensive.
able to, and I cash flowed that. And then, when one kid, it was still a state school. So
Yep.
yeah, I think that there is that component as well as your cash flow.
And I think a bigger issue that comes up, you had mentioned this before we were recording, that we see causing issues is it's not the technical side of it. It's more like making sure families, or especially the couples, are on the same page with like what is the goal for
Hmm.
this and how important it is. Because in my conversations, it's pretty rare that like both spouses are like rock solid on the same page. More often, it's like one spouse. Sometimes it's like one spouse is like, I don't want to fund any college. I paid for it. Usually, it's like, I don't want to fund any college. I paid for it myself, and I'd like my kids to learn the hard, good lessons that I learned
Hmm.
because I paid for, as a result of paying it myself. And then the other spouse is like, well, my family funded mine completely, and it gave me the huge financial benefits of not having to take out student loans. And I want my kid to experience that. And that's
Sure.
so that like is two totally different viewpoints.
Yeah. Yeah, for
And so
sure.
coming to a compromise is
Yeah.
a good, I mean, that's an important starting point. You can't just be like, well, even though we're on two polar opposites, we're just going to fund the 529 or not fund it. It's like,
Yeah.
what's the compromise?
Well, one thing with my husband and I, when we started funding our accounts when the kids were newborns, but my husband was kind of like, why would we do this? They're newborns, like college is so far away. And then I showed him a compounding chart of like, wait, but we can put this amount of money in now and then stop funding, or that money will grow. Whereas if we wait 10 years, it'll be X amount more money that we'll have to save. And for him and his brain, that worked, but everyone's different. And the other
Yep.
thing too is, I was talking to Dana too about this idea that also, you may have family members who have dropped hints that they may want to contribute for college, and it is probably in everyone's best interest. And I know these can be weird conversations, but get a sense of what they're planning, because the other thing too is you don't want to have a fully funded 529 and then you're find out your grandparents have also started a 529. I know that has happened before too, where you have dueling accounts. So it's just good to be on the same page with other family members as well. So that can help with planning. And you can use it in the context of, hey, we're trying to plan this out and be thoughtful about what we're saving. We've commented that you wanted to contribute, can you give me a sense of what you're thinking, that kind of thing. So
I've talked to families that got a little more proactive about this, and for example, they were like, to their family, they were like, we would prefer that you stop sending us like the garbage plastic toys stuff. We
mhm.
got enough of those, and then it'd be great if you could fund the kids 529s instead. I
Yeah.
mean that, and then the family was like, oh, okay, and so it's pretty easy actually to set that up in most 529s where you
Yeah, a
can
lot of them are very upfront with like gifting type links that you can send to
grandparent
relatives to.
friendly or whatever.
Yeah,
It's
yeah.
like
So that's great too.
much better to, and so yeah, getting on the same page, communication, and then even like proactively suggesting they would prefer gifts go there instead of the junk that people a lot of times buy.
Yeah.
And yeah, communication is the big thing. And even with the kids themselves, um, when they get to, I mean, you're not going to be like your newborn or 5-year-old, like,
Yeah.
hey, by the way, you got a 529. But I mean, maybe at like 7 and 8 years old. I know some people start to talk to their really young kids about the 529s, but you kind of have to be careful. I could see two sides. It's like I don't want my kid to think like they're golden, but I also don't want my kid to think they got nothing. And a lot of parents, I think, are struggling with that, and then they just do nothing.
Yeah. And I think, I've thought about this too, because both my sons have separate 529 accounts. And, the truth is you don't have, you can say that you're saving, and that I think it's really important to tell them at an age appropriate, whether it's end of elementary, junior high, but do it before they're looking at colleges, kind of what the expectation is from what you expect from them from a funding perspective, and
Mhm.
what you're planning on giving, because that will set them up to maybe hopefully be more realistic in what they're looking at college wise. So it's less about the dollar amount, but the fact that
The goal.
whether or not you are saving, and essentially kind of what the expectations are from what the parent, you as a parent, want to contribute, and what they should anticipate to contribute as well.
Yeah, because and even if you have no 529s, you
Yeah.
probably ought to um let your child know, like, by the way, you're on your own for college.
Yeah.
FYI. Like, I
Yeah.
knew I was in a good spot. Well, I mean, I was in a spot where it was obvious because my parents were basically broke. So I'm like, they're not funding they're not
Yeah. Yeah.
funding
Yeah.
college. So I was like, there's no need to have the conversation. But I
Right.
think I could see that being more likely. I didn't grow up in this case, but I could see it being more likely when your parents like drive nice cars and they're in a nice house
Oh
and
yeah.
the kids are like, my parents have money, is like usually just kind of the conclusion. So in that case, they're going to be like, my parents have money, so therefore they are going to fund my college. And then that would
Hmm.
be a big letdown when the kids are like, oh shoot.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. So yeah. So any parting thoughts?
Did we hit on all the any
I
other
think I
misunderstanding
think for the
about?
most part, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, they're generally great tools if you know you're going to have future education costs. Um,
Oh, one thing too, just so people, this is a misconception around what you can use these funds for or not. So this idea, people throw out this, they get a full ride scenario. If
mhm.
that is the case, there are ways to take the funds out of the 529 that are equivalent to the scholarship. You'll have to pay taxes on it, but you won't be penalized for it. So in that scenario, it is not, a make or break it with your 529 funds. You will be able to access the funds in an equivalent fashion. So that's, just want to take that off the table as a.
Yeah, and they're so flexible in terms of like when you take it out so that you can be pretty strategic about it. You can be like, well, let's figure out the most optimal. Like if you're in a situation where you know you're going to have to pay the taxes on it because there's just no way to use it for
Yeah.
education, you can start to be like, well, okay, and now we're shifting to like, let's see how strategic we can possibly get to minimize the tax as much as possible. And it's pretty flexible in that regard. It's like you can kind of like cherry pick the years or whatever,
Hmm.
minimize the tax as much as possible. And um, but yeah, we try to help people like avoid that circumstance at all costs. It's like, well, what about the grandkids? What about your future education costs?
Right.
What about you yourself having continuing education? What about boards or test prep or whatever? And a lot of times there's just education things you're not really thinking about. So
Yeah.
anyway.
Yes. So I think the takeaway is, if you can, start as soon as you can. Doesn't
Mhm.
have to be a lot of money to contribute to these accounts, but the longer runway you have, the more likelihood you are to, benefit from that compound growth.
Yeah, when in doubt, if you have kids, I would start it. I would go with like set up, figure out the best 529 plan, um, and set it up to have automatic, ideally it's automatic monthly deposits, just so you can, it just happens.
Hmm.
And then you can tweak the monthly number as you start to iron out what the goal is. And then I don't think that kind of, most people, when they get older, they're like, man, I'm glad I did that. Or they're like, man, I wish I'd done that. So
Hmm.
that's the kind of thing you just got to start early.
Yeah.
So,
Great.
all right. Well, Theresa, thanks for coming on and
Yep.
talking a little 529.
Excellent. All right. Thanks.
No guests or clients appearing on the podcast received any form of compensation for their appearance and obtained no other benefit from us. It should not be assumed that every client has had the same experience.